In 1985, Steve Jobs walked away from the company he had helped build. 11 years later, Apple paid $428 million to buy the company he created after leaving. That deal brought Jobs back to Apple. The strange part is that the company Apple bought was not a blockbuster success. So why did Apple need it badly enough to bring back the co-founder it had lost? Apple began as an unlikely three-person partnership. On April 1st, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne signed the document that created Apple Computer. The first machines were built in the Los Altos home of Jobs' parents. The Apple II became a hit. Then the Macintosh made the computer feel less like a machine for specialists and more like an object people could meet with a mouse and a screen. Success made the stakes vicious. Apple had recruited Pepsi executive John Sculley as chief executive. By 1985, the relationship between Jobs and Sculley had become a struggle over direction and authority. Apple removed Jobs from day-to-day control of the Macintosh group. In September, he resigned as chairman. Decades later, Jobs used a shorter phrase for the experience. He said he'd been fired from Apple. For a founder, that is a particular kind of loss. The product is not merely an employer. It carries the story you tell yourself about why your life matters. Apple was now public, famous, and running without the person most associated with its early vision. Jobs was 30 years old, wealthy and widely known, but he had lost control of the institution that had given his ambition a home. He did not retire. In 1985, he founded Next. The new company pursued an expensive workstation for education and business, with a polished black cube, unusual engineering, and a software platform built to make powerful computing easier to use. It was a grand attempt to begin again. It was also a hard business. Next hardware did not become the mass-market success Apple had been. That failure matters because it changes the usual comeback story. The years away were not a clean climb from defeat to triumph. Jobs made choices that were costly. He bet on a machine that was too expensive for many buyers. He had to build a new team, persuade new customers, and work without the vast manufacturing, sales, and cultural reach of Apple. But Next created something more durable than its hardware sales: software. Its operating system technology became the core reason Apple came knocking. By the mid-1990s, Apple had cycled through leaders and was losing ground in the personal computer market. The company needed a modern software foundation. In late 1996, Apple agreed to acquire Next for $428 million. In 1997, Jobs returned as an advisor. At first, the return did not look like a coronation. Jobs had told people he wanted to focus on his family and on Pixar, the animation company he had bought from George Lucas years earlier. Apple, however, was in crisis. In September 1997, its board named Jobs interim chief executive. The word interim sounded temporary. It became the beginning of a different Apple. To understand why that role mattered, look at the problem Apple faced when he arrived. A company can have famous products and still lose its way when too many bets compete for the same attention. Apple had a valuable name, loyal customers, and talented people. It also needed a clearer answer to a basic question: which products deserve the company's limited time, money, and engineering effort? Jobs' return gave Apple a person willing to make choices that disappointed people in the short term. Those choices were not glamorous. A turnaround is often described through the products that arrive later, because those images are easy to remember. The harder work comes earlier, deciding what to stop doing, which unfinished promises to abandon, and where a company's identity has become too broad to be useful. In that sense, the Next acquisition delivered more than software. It returned someone who had spent 11 years operating without Apple's scale and had learned how expensive every unfocused decision could become. The public saw a founder return. Inside the story, the return was also an acquisition. Apple did not simply restore an old leader to an old office. It bought a company, brought in its people and technology, and accepted that the person it had lost had built something it now needed. That distinction matters. A comeback can look like destiny after the fact. At the time, it was a costly business decision made by a company under pressure. The number itself tells part of the story. $428 million was the price Apple paid for Next. But the visible price is only the final line of a longer ledger. Before it came in 1985 departure, the years of trying to sell a difficult product, the work of building a software platform, and the slow realization that Apple's own plans were not enough. The purchase made a striking admission. Leaving had not erased Jobs' relevance. It had changed the form of what he could bring back. The lesson was not that founders are always right. Jobs had been hard to work with, and the 1985 conflict did not happen because one person carried all the blame. The deeper lesson is that a company can mistake a clash of methods for a lack of value. Apple lost Jobs' daily leadership. Then, over 11 years, it discovered it also needed the technology and product instincts that his exile had sharpened. Jobs' return was painful precisely because it forced Apple to admit what it lacked. The company had not bought a magical rescue button. It bought Next technology, and it regained a leader who had spent years learning outside Apple's walls. The result was a platform that would underpin the next era of Apple products, from Mac OS X to the systems that followed. There is another reason this story holds up 50 years after Apple's founding. The public version of success makes a career look like one straight line: garage, breakthrough, fame, empire. The real version is rougher. Jobs helped create Apple. He lost his place there. He made a new company whose hardware did not conquer the market. Then that supposedly failed detour became part of Apple's recovery. In his 2005 Stanford speech, Jobs said the heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. That was his interpretation, spoken long after the crisis. It should not turn the story into a motivational poster. Starting over was possible because he had resources, connections, and a rare record. Yet the core fact remains difficult to ignore. The company that lost him eventually paid to get his work back. The comeback was not a reversal of one bad day. It was an 11-year chain of consequences, a struggle for control, a resignation, a new company, years of imperfect work, and an acquisition born from Apple's need. When people say that a setback worked out, they usually erase the uncertain years in the middle. Those years were the story. Apple's 50th anniversary invites a simpler question than: was Steve Jobs a genius? What does an organization lose when it treats a difficult person as fully replaceable? Apple's answer arrived 11 years later in a $428 million purchase. It had to buy back a piece of the future it had let walk away. If you want more original stories about the decisions that changed famous lives and companies, subscribe. The next story begins where the public version ends.